warm welcome to this bumper Wednesday edition of The Lead on News 24. Up next, a transgender inmate in Johannesburg Central Prison fights for their right to access the use of women's clothes and gender-affirming healthcare.
Here she just talks about how she was apparently refused a woman's uniform, and when she did request it, what they apparently told her was, we can't give you a woman's uniform, you're classified as male, what we can potentially do is give you a uniform for a younger inmate, and what they said was that should be tight enough. Now she found that incredibly humiliating. It didn't obviously solve her problem. She also says that her sister had brought her makeup to wear. This was confiscated. She tells the story of how she had made her own skirts and was wearing them, but when she was dressed in them, she was refused visits with her family and her lawyers.
Later in the show, a group of Chinese nationals are sentenced for running a human-trafficking sweatshop out of the Johannesburg CBD.
They were sentenced to kind of smaller sentences for several of the charges, 2 years here, 1 year here, but ultimately all the sentences were ordered to run concurrently with the 20-year sentence that they got for human trafficking.
Both updates courtesy of our News 24 star court journalist Bernadette Wicks. Next. And finally, Walmart's coming to Mzansi, but analysts warn its market staying power will be tested.
Got something to say about this topic? Drop us a short voice note on the Leeds WhatsApp hotline. That's 072 562 3179.
It's official, The Lead's been listened to nearly 600,000 times. This is episode 102. Please rate us 5 stars, hit like, follow and subscribe on Apple, Spotify and YouTube. That's to stay notified of our next episode. My name's Graeme Raubenheimer, this is The Lead, and this is the South African story. Moving to the Lead's top story today, an inmate currently held at Johannesburg Prison who was born a male but has long since identified as a transgender woman is now pursuing a potentially landmark case against the Correctional Services Ministry. Ntabiseng Mokoena is currently serving life behind bars for robbery and murder, but she alleges that she's been harassed and unfairly discriminated against inside prison by wardens who've refused her access to gender-affirming healthcare, women's clothes and an appropriate cell, which the Correctional Services Commissioner has since on record denied. But to tell us more about Mokwena's truly unique story, we're joined live now from Johannesburg by our court and crime journalist, Bernadette Wicks. Bernadette, thank you so much for joining us on The Lead today.
Always good to be with you, Graeme.
Fantastic. This is quite the interesting story, and I think from the outset, based on some of the remarks already to your article on the story that's already been published entitled Life Behind Bars, Transgender Inmate Fights for Rights in Landmark Equality Court Case, some of our readers have taken issue, if you will, saying, you know, they don't believe in referring to Mokoena as she. For the purposes of this podcast, because this inmate identifies as a woman, we will be referring to her as she, right?
Yes, absolutely. Ultimately, what someone identifies as, at least, is at the day up to them. She identifies as a woman, and that's how we will refer to her, and that's how we have referred to her.
Yeah, and if you don't like that, you're free to tune out of this particular podcast. Anyway, let's move on to the story now. Let's go through Mokwena's early life as she relays it in court papers that have been filed before the Equality Court. She already knew from an early age that she identifies as a woman. Is that right?
Her early life is kind of quite a sad story, and a story we've heard before from members of the LGBTQI community and specifically transgender people. She, as you said, was born a male. At around the age of 7, she said she started questioning her gender identity. She was raised by her grandmother, and she said this was a very difficult notion for her grandmother and her broader family, really, to understand, and that she was beaten regularly as a child when she tried to express herself as a woman, that she was treated sort of as the black sheep of the family, and that she felt very isolated. And eventually, when she was 17, secretly dropped out of school and kind of fell in with with a bad crowd, with a gang of, essentially a gang of criminals, is how she describes it in her court papers. And she says this is ultimately what sort of started her descent into a life of crime. But she speaks a lot about being very confused about the feelings she had, about struggling with looking in the mirror and seeing someone looking back at her who she didn't identify with. And we have heard these kinds of stories previously from other people from this community. It's incredibly sad.
And for the record, Mokoena obviously ran foul of the law, and she's now serving a life sentence for murder and robbery. Is that right? Do we know a little bit more about the extent of her crimes?
Well, we don't know a lot about the details surrounding her crimes, but we do know that ultimately in 2010 at least, she was arrested and charged with various crimes: robbery, murder, possession of unlawful ammunition and firearms, possession of stolen property, and she was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison for the crimes.
Right. So she's now at Johannesburg. They call it Sun City, right? As I understand it, she's in the men's initially in the men's medium A section. There initially, it's understood. Well, she had a fairly okay time. She was sharing a cell with another like-minded individual who has a similar story to tell, and the conditions weren't as bad, but things kind of took a turn for a worse. Take us through that.
So she lays out in her court papers how when she was in the medium A section, she was allowed to wear makeup, she could wear her hair long, she was kind of embraced for who she was. She could take part in drama and performances that they put on at the prison. But she did say that she was subsequently transferred, I believe it was first to Section C, and then Section B. She did say things sort of started taking a turn for the worst when she was initially moved to Section C, but she says Section B, where she is currently, has really been the biggest issue. And here she just talks about how she was apparently refused a woman's uniform. And when she did request it, what they apparently told her was, we can't give you a woman's uniform. You're classified as male. What we can potentially do is give you a uniform for a younger inmate. And what they said was that should be tight enough. Now, she found that incredibly humiliating. Yeah. It didn't obviously solve her problem. She also says that her sister had brought her makeup to wear. This was confiscated. She tells the story of how she had made her own skirts and was wearing them, but when she was dressed in them, she was refused visits with her family and her lawyers while wearing the skirts, and she says the skirts were ultimately confiscated. It is important to note that a lot of these claims, as you mentioned earlier, the Commissioner of Correctional Services is opposing this case, and he does dispute several of these claims, but this is her version.
She also shares what it's like to share a cell with somebody else that she's sort of been lumped into a category with another person who identifies as gay within the context of the men's side of the prison. Obviously, that's not the same level of nuance that we even approaching this conversation with, right? But what does the Correctional Services Commissioner say? And it's not surprising that obviously the issue of overcrowding was sort of the go-to sort of excuse here, right?
Well, first prize is obviously to place an inmate with someone who has sort of similar needs and experiences as that person. And like we mentioned earlier, when she was initially placed in the A section of the prison, she was sharing a cell with another transgender person. And she said this really sort of helped her to feel safe. Currently, like you say, she's now sharing a cell with a man who identifies as gay. And she says, while you understand why this might have been a consideration for correctional services, she says ultimately they have very different needs, very different experiences, very different privacy needs. And it's not ideal. And she says it's not just her, it's not ideal for her cellmate either. He too is struggling with it. But like you say, the commissioner basically says overcrowding. We don't have the option to put her in a cell by herself. And what the commissioner says is there are no other transgender inmates in the section where she currently is, so we can't house her with another transgender inmate. So that's the position that DCS essentially has taken.
What I thought so fascinating about what we understand through the court papers, what you've uncovered with this particular case, Bernadette, is a very well-known psychologist, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne. Of course, he's profiled, as I understand it, serial killers in the past within the context of South Africa. And he's essentially diagnosed Ms. Mokoena as suffering from gender dysphoria. What is that, and what do we know about this?
So essentially what we understand of gender dysphoria is it is a situation where people's physical appearance and the way that and the gender with to which they're assigned at birth doesn't align with what they feel internally, with how they identify internally. And there are various sort of symptoms that need to be confirmed by a medical professional before it can officially be diagnosed. And like you say, Dr. Gerard Labuschagne was one of the who interviewed her and who diagnosed her, but there were a total of 4 doctors, psychiatrists, and psychologists who all essentially came to the same conclusion, and recommended that she be allowed to express her gender identity and that she be assisted with going on hormone replacement therapy and ultimately fully transitioning.
Again, sort of reading some of the reactions to your initial article, and I don't want to give too much light to some of the vile sort of sentiment that is being shared. But the general gist is what I'm getting as understanding it is people are tending to conflate, because she's been convicted of murder, she has therefore no other rights are allowed for this particular individual. I mean, that's ludicrous.
Of course it is. And I mean, I think in South Africa, the reality is that we live with so much crime that people become quite hardened, and it's difficult for them to be compassionate or sympathetic or empathetic when it comes to inmates. But what we need to remember is these are still human beings, and I think it's very much a situation of it's easy to judge until it's you or someone you know or someone you love or someone you are related to who's in prison. The other important thing to remember is that our prison system is not in a situation where we can put people in prison, throw away the key and forget about them. Ultimately, a large portion, the vast majority of our prisoners are at some point going to be released back into society. And what we're trying to do while they're in prison is rehabilitate them. And part of that is teaching them how to respect other people and how important it is to afford other people dignity and how to live with other people. How are we able to teach people that if we're not treating them with that kind of respect and dignity? It's incredibly important. And it's also just simply in terms of the Constitution, the fact that we live in a constitutional democracy, prisoners and inmates are afforded certain basic human rights.
As we've alluded to already, Correctional Services Commissioner Mokgoti Tabogale has already sort of refuted, sort of straight down the middle, the claims that Ms. Mokoena, wasn't given allowed access to visits, gender-affirming healthcare, adequate clothing, etc. What is she sort of hoping to sort of state before the Equality Court? What is the desired outcome at the end of the day with the help of lawyers for human rights that she's sort of hoping to achieve? Is it just to say that she's been unfairly treated, or would this go speak to something like policy reforms within the correctional services space as we know it? Do you know?
Yeah, so the relief she's seeking is quite extensive. She does want a declaration that the way she's been treated basically constitutes unfair discrimination and harassment. But she also wants orders directing DCS to allow her to dress in women's clothing, wear makeup, use the toiletries that women require. And then B, she also wants an order directing the DCS to help her sort of start the process of legally transitioning. And now that's going to include things like changing the gender markers in her identity documents. But before that can be done, she needs medical treatment. So part of the relief she's seeking as well is for the DCS basically to be ordered to help put her on hormone replacement therapy. And her argument is that this is covered under the primary health care that the Correctional Services Act provides must be provided to prisoners. She says if the court finds it isn't, then what she wants is a reading in, basically, of the legislation so that this is included under primary health care.
Sure. It's not just lawyers for human rights, Bernadette. There are some friends of the court here in this particular case, right?
Yes. So JICS, the Judicial Inspectorate for Correctional Services, has been admitted as a friend of the court. We do know that Ms. Mokoena was actually liaising directly with JIX to try and get her issues resolved before she went to court. And then Access Chapter 2, which is an NGO that focuses on the rights of members of the LGBTQI community, has also been admitted as a friend of the court in the case.
Cases this Friday. Will you be there? Is it open to the media? I'd imagine only sort of arguments will be put forward, affidavits submitted, correct?
So it is going to be heard on Friday. It's going to be heard in the Equality Court sitting in the Johannesburg High Court. It will be open to the public, as all court cases are, despite the sensitive nature of some of the issues that are obviously being discussed. We also know that Lawyers for Human Rights has publicly named their client. And so while in these kinds of cases, on some occasions, we might sort of want to protect people's identity because it has to do with their medical health and stuff. The understanding is if Lawyers for Human Rights has come out with her name, she is okay being named and identified in public. We will definitely be following arguments on Friday. What we can probably expect is arguments from DCS, arguments from Ms. Mokoena, arguments from the Friends of the Court, and then the case will likely be postponed for the court to deliberate and come up with a ruling.
Do you think, final question, do you think potentially groundbreaking? Do we know if there's any other precedents in this particular space?
Definitely potentially groundbreaking. I do think that transgender people's rights are something that we've only really started discussing seriously in the last couple of years. So there hasn't been a lot of jurisprudence in general. In this instance, what is of significance is, I believe it was 2019, there was a ruling on another transgender inmate. Her name was Jade September, and that had to do with access to women's clothing, toiletry, and being able to express in that case. So that has kind of paved the way, I think, for this case. But what is being sought in this case is quite significantly more nuanced, more specific, more unique. So I definitely do think that it will potentially build on the jurisprudence that we're in the process of building at the moment in this area.
Trending topic.
Well, moving to our trending topic now, and 7 Chinese nationals found guilty of a raft of crimes, including human trafficking, have now learned their fate in central Johannesburg. The group of Chinese men and women were first arrested back in 2019 before lockdown, following a raid on their premises of their illegal Sweatshop operating right at the heart of the CBD. There, various authorities, including Home Affairs, the Hawks, found numerous Malawian children specifically forced against their will to work in some appalling conditions. Well, we cross back to our court reporter Bernadette Wicks, who's covered the sentencing proceedings today. Thanks for sticking around, Bernadette. What was the sentencing?
Well, essentially, they were all sentenced to an effective 20 years behind bars. There were a total of 158 counts that they were convicted of, and those range from human trafficking to contraventions of immigration law, labor law, and they were sentenced to kind of smaller sentences for several of the charges, 2 years here, 1 year here. But ultimately, all the sentences were ordered to run concurrently with the 20-year sentence that they got for human trafficking. The minimum prescribed sentence for human trafficking is actually life behind bars, but the court did find that there were substantial and compelling reasons to deviate from that in this instance and sort of took about 5 years off of that.
Sure. Take us back to that scene in 2019, if you can. A lot of undocumented migrants forced to work in these terrible conditions. To make clothing? Forced to make clothing?
Yeah, from what we understand, it was a textiles factory, and they made inners for duvets and blankets. Horrendous conditions that they were made to work and live in. So we understand that these 90-something foreign nationals who were found during this raid were forced to live on the premises. They weren't allowed to leave the premises. There were armed guards at the entrances and exits to make sure that they couldn't leave. They weren't trained to use machinery that they were required to use. Many of them ended up being maimed, losing fingers, losing limbs. One person lost his vision, at least in one eye, after an accident at work. They were also not allowed to take sick days. They were forced to work 7 days a week for 11 hours at a time. They were paid below minimum wage. I mean, just the most awful conditions. And like you say, I mean, horrible on any count, but 37 of these individuals who were found were minors. They were children, which just makes it so much worse.
One of the victims, one of the workers forced against their will, took the stand. I'm just reading back to some of the News 24 reportage at the time, told the court previously how he and his colleagues were, quote unquote, not allowed to use cell phones. They weren't allowed to even listen to the radio or even invite friends over. This was a mass sort of human trafficking operation. Here's a Hawk success story, if you will.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that it's quite significant in the labor sort of realm broadly, because we know anecdotally, we know from firsthand experience that this is not the only place where this is going on. And what we did hear from the Deputy Minister for Labour, who was at today's proceedings, was that they want to take this case and kind of use it as the benchmark for prosecuting further cases involving infringements of the labour law. So a significant, important case, and hopefully, like they were saying today, it can act as a deterrent and can sort of make similarly minded individuals realize that the long arm of the law will eventually catch up with them.
Thanks so much, Bernadette. I really do appreciate it, giving us solid updates on two very important cases, both potentially precedent-setting in their own right. I really appreciate your time here on The Lead today.
Absolutely. Anytime, Graeme.
Looking for a smarter weekend scroll? The Weekender is your ultimate guide to bold stories, sharp opinion, and a fresh lens on life in Mzansi. From exclusive interviews and powerful essays to wine picks, playlists, and pop culture gems, it's your perfect weekend read all in one place, landing every Saturday on News 24. And finally,
Mzansi may be inundated with malls, shops and petrol stations, but well-known American retailer Walmart sees scope for expanding here, revealing that it's expected to open its very first South African stores by the end of the year. The local Walmart will sell almost everything under the sun. That's from fresh produce to televisions. It's not yet clear, though, how many branches will spring up, but Walmart has indicated that local goods will be front and center. Well, it's told News 24's Nick Wilson that it's also keeping its separate game, Builders Warehouse and Macro brands, so don't expect those to go away suddenly. But retail analysts warn Walmart will have to be careful in a shrinking brand-loyal market such as South Africa, especially in rural areas that will never have heard of Walmart before. In other words, there are fears that Walmart could end up competing against itself because of its already well-established brands. Anyways, like Starbucks, I'm sure there'll be plenty of selfies in the long queue on day one. But will interests last? Also, The Lead executive producer Simon Sonicus wants to know if Walmart, like in the States, will sell firearms. Something like that surely won't fly here, but it's a story nonetheless to watch in future. Ending off now with On This Day in History, the 10th of September 1960. Ethiopian Abebe Bikila, running barefoot, became the very first black African to win gold in the history of the entire Olympic Games. In the process, Bikila had even set a new world record. Explaining later why he ran barefoot, Bikila indicated that I, quote-unquote, wanted the world to know that my country, Ethiopia, has always won with determination and heroism. 4 years later, during the Tokyo Olympics, Abebe's fame had already reached all corners of the globe. 6 weeks before the big race that awaited him, Abebe was taken ill, though, with appendicitis. He underwent surgery amid a public outcry for proper medical counsel to decide on the procedure. The day that he had arrived in Tokyo, Abebe hadn't fully recovered from the surgery and limped his way down the stairs. However, the reception Abebe received from the Japanese people helped him to become the very first athlete ever to win 2 Olympic marathons. Bikila sadly died in October 1973. That's courtesy South African History Online on this day in history, the 10th of September 1960. Got anything top of mind to share about this edition of The Lead? Send us your thoughts and opinions to 072 562 3179. My name's Graeme Raubenheimer. So long as there's trusted news first, we'll have The Lead.